You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Kudlak.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Kudlak. I'm one of the hosts of the show, and today I am joined by my lovely co-host, Amber Wilcox.
Finally, right? I think that I've been absent for quite a few episodes already, so it's good to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited to have you. We are both super busy, and it can be a lot to schedule, all of our, find a time that actually works for us and then the guests too. So
Yes, I was telling our guest, he asked how often we did this, and I said, well, I'm pregnant with a toddler, and so lately it's been like a doctor's appointment for me, a doctor's appointment for him. We were all sick last week, so I feel like here in Florida, we fight the winter sickness in the summer, which is always really fun. So, well, with that said, I'm very excited for us to be live today. So if anyone has any questions in real time, very exciting for you to just stick them in the chat. But today's podcast is powered by the Board of Certification for Emergency Nursing, BCEN. The BCEN is committed to advancing burn care through the Certified Burn Registered Nurse, or CBRN, credential, a certification designed to recognize specialized knowledge and expertise across the burn care continuum. Learn more by visiting bcen.org.
Yes, well, thank you to BCEN. And today I'm very excited not only to be live, but to welcome an exciting guest with a very timely topic that we'll be chatting about. So today we are welcoming on Craig Crandall. Craig is a professor of internal medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center and is the director of the Thermal and Vascular Psychology Laboratory at Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital, Dallas. And for over 20 years, he has been continuously funded by the NIH to assess the long-term thermoregulatory and cardiovascular consequences of severe burn injuries. So thank you so much, Craig, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Hello, Amber. Hi, Rachel. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to spending some time with you as well as some burn survivors.
Absolutely. Well, Craig, let's get started a little bit about your work. And for those that don't know you, what led you to study heat regulation in burn survivors?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I'll give you the abbreviated version of it. About 25 years ago, a colleague of mine was bitten by a brown recluse spider. And it was so bad that the individual ended up having to have a graft placed on the bite. And I was starting up my thermal and vascular physiology laboratory here in Dallas and invited her in, and we just did a standard heat stress to see what happened as far as skin blood flow and sweating at that grafted site. And nothing happened. Normally, when we heat individuals, skin blood flow increases and those areas sweat, but it did not. And that got us down a line of research that, again, that's really been the mainstay of my career now for 25 years, studying the consequences of graft burn injuries. Of course, that was a spider bite, but the effect was the same: damage to the skin resulting in a graft, and the long-term consequences of that for burn survivors. And it's been really enjoyable pursuing these questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, so tell us just a little bit more about, when you first started working with burn survivors specifically and just how you got involved in burn care. And working with burn survivors.
So once we became curious about the long-term effects of these burn injuries, I'd be very fortunate in that I'm in Dallas and I'm on faculty at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, who has Parkland Hospital, which is a major burn center. In fact, is the regional burn center for all of North Texas, has many burn surgeons. So I spent some time with the burn surgeons there, and also the rehabilitation physicians focusing on burn survivors, and talking with them about some of these interests that I have. And then we wrote some grants. Dr. Karen Kowalski, who's been now at UT Southwestern for 35 years, is a co-investigator on a lot of our projects, and she is a rehabilitation specialist focusing on burned, injured individuals. And our very first project we did, we simply brought well-healed burn survivors in that had a very distinct area between a burn and a non-burned piece of skin, for the lack of a better word. So let's just say, for example, a classic example would be somebody who had a motorcycle accident and the exhaust pipe burned their leg. So we've got a very defined area of a burned and grafted and a non-burned area. And then we brought them into the lab, and we had the capability of doing a heat stress with water perfused suits. They're little suits that have lots of tubes running through that the person wears. We put the suit on and heated their core temperature, and that causes the brain to send a signal for the skin to dilate and sweat. And then we have the capability of measuring skin blood flow from the grafted areas, and then right next to it, the non-grafted areas, and came up with some very pretty pictures showing that those grafted areas, they don't dilate at all, nor do they sweat, which in humans is the two primary ways by which we regulate temperature. So once we realized that the grafted skin doesn't dilate, it doesn't sweat, our next question will, how long does this persist? And we found that it's that adverse consequence persists for the entire life of the individual. There's no evidence that there's a return of normal vasodilator function in the skin or sweating function in the skin. And so that was the first set of NIH-funded studies that we had, was to characterize what happens with these burn survivor, with the burned areas, and how long does that effect persist, which is for the life of the burn survivor.
Well, tell us just a little bit more too about, thermoregulation. I know I said that word in your bio,
Yeah.
but just for those who maybe don't even know what that means, can you just kind of break that down for us?
Sure, of course. Thermoregulation is a fancy word that describes how our body regulates its temperature. We as humans regulate our temperature very well, and our body wants to work within a normal range. And let's say, for example, 98 degrees, if we're speaking in the Fahrenheit scale. Thermoregulation, what that means is, what are some of the ways by which our body maintains that temperature within that 98 degrees? And for humans, we have two primary ways that we do that when we're hot. So that is, let's say we're exercising and our core temperature now is going from 98 to, let's say, 99. Our brain detects that increase and sends a signal through the nerves to the skin, and it causes the skin and blood flow to increase, and that allows heat from the muscles to be delivered to the skin and then ultimately to the environment, which works very well unless the environment's very humid, or I'm sorry, the environment's very, very hot. And if that's the case, you need to have sweating. And so the second mechanism by which we regulate temperature is through increases of water developed on the skin. We call that sweat. When that sweat evaporates, that then cools the skin as well. So we have these two really important mechanisms, and that is skin blood flow changes and sweating changes to regulate and try to get our body temperature around that 98 degrees. But if, for example, a burn survivor, we know now that that area does not sweat, a significant burn injured site does not sweat and does not increase blood flow. Now that person doesn't have the same capability as a non-injured person does in regulating their temperature. So we would argue that individuals with significant burn injuries have a compromised thermoregulation. That is, a compromised ability to regulate their body temperature around the normal range that our body likes to stay at.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, okay, we've talked about surface area, and I know we're going to get into the heat risk calculator in a little bit, but do you feel like the location in which someone has a burn injury, so someone has burn injury on their hands versus in their armpits, do you feel like in your research that has an impact of like the location of the burn injury mattering in addition to the surface area?
It's a great question. It's a very valid question because different areas of our bodies sweat differently. Like the back might sweat more than the forearm or something like that. The Army had the same question and funded us to look at that very question. And what we found when we did a very controlled study by actually simulating a burn injury, by covering the skin with a water absorbent material that didn't have the capacity to sweat. So we effectively caused a simulated. So now we can say we're going to have a 40% body surface area burn, and we can move that body surface area burn anywhere on the body, maintaining that same 40%. We found that as far as body temperature regulation, it did not matter. So whether that burn was on the legs or on the torso or on the arms, what mattered was how much of the body surface area was burned, not so much where that burn occurred.
That's so interesting. Just the fact that it doesn't really matter. And, to your point that all burn survivors, this is something we all have to deal with. Again, obviously, I'm sure those with like a larger TBSA have some different difficulties than those with the lower TBSA, but that, there's things that we can do to manage it. But at the end of the day, it's something that's always going to be a part of the burn survivor journey.
Yeah, Rachel, you brought a good point about managing it. One of the interests we have is what could we do to reduce the risk that a burn survivor might have. And we know that the individual's normal skin has the capability to compensate. We call that heat acclimation. And that is individuals that over time, as they're exposed to their heat, their skin has the capability to compensate so that now you can regulate your temperature after you've been exposed for maybe 2 weeks to some mild heat stress. And we found, again, funded by the NIH, that burn survivors retain their capacity to regulate, to compensate or to acclimate to the heat. And so although the burned skin did not change, we found that the non-burned skin did change, and that is it sweat more and it dilated more. So now the individual was able to tolerate the heat better after they were heat acclimated, again, because of the non-injured skin being modified, whereas nothing happened with the burn injured skin. So there are some ways.
When you say heat acclimated, I want to understand what that means. So are we saying like, I've been outside in 90-degree weather, for 5 minutes versus being out here for 30 minutes? Or are you saying like over time, meaning like over the course of 3 months, I've dealt with the 90-degree weather here in Florida and have gotten better? What does acclimation, I guess, really mean is my question.
Sure. It's the latter. And that is what we find. And let's just take a classic example would be a football player. So you live in Florida, you get a football player, the very first day, the worst thing a coach can do is to put them in the heat and have them run real hard for a couple hours. But if every day he or she exposes them to the heat for 30 minutes and then 40 minutes and then 50 minutes, and over the course of 2 weeks, that their risk for heat injury after the 2 weeks of daily exposure to the heat is far less than the first day. So that's what heat acclimation is that our body's ability to adjust to the exposure to the heat over a series of days. And usually it occurs after a couple of weeks of somebody who is not acclimated. So if you take somebody, for example, I don't know, from Alaska and send them to Florida and then expose them to the heat, after about 2 weeks, they would be acclimated to that heat. So again, not hours or minutes, but days.
I feel like that's an interesting tip for survivors, right? Because sometimes like, I feel like even, okay, I'm going, like I spend most of my time inside, but I'm going on a vacation out in the sun at Disney World for a week, right? Like maybe consider like getting outside a couple of weeks before doing that or something. Cause I feel like that's a great advice that I don't know that is always talked about. And maybe it's something we can, again, surface more, Rachel, in the future, but like acclimation, I feel like is a big deal. And I noticed that too, like right at the start of summer, you're like, oh my gosh, it's so hot. I can't handle it. But I start to get used to it the more time I spend outside. So I think that's also just an interesting call out for survivors of like spending 6 hours in the sun on your first day doing something is probably a crazy idea. So like over time, right, building your body up to that and like knowing that you have your limits is just such a great, I mean, for anyone, but especially for a burn survivor.
Yeah, I agree completely. Knowing that you've got burn survivors have the capability to improve their tolerance to the heat, to me is
Mm.
very important and very huge. And I love your analogy that, if you're gonna take a trip to Disney World, you get some exposure to the heat ahead of time. Your first few days at Disney World would be much more enjoyable.
I always think about like, folks always think it's a good idea to come to Disney and like in summertime because they're out of school up north and stuff. And I'm always like, you don't know what you're doing. Like if you're from the cold climates and you come down here and then you go outside in 100-degree weather on day one and you spend 12 hours outside in the heat, like you're not going to be able to
Mm.
handle it. Like of course it's going to get better throughout the week. But I think acclimating yourself and knowing your limits. I know one of the things we wanted to ask is like, how do you know when you're at an unsafe level? But also, I think in the beginning of like understanding, like, if you are a burn survivor, like you can't expect to go full throttle on day one in any kind of climate with
Correct.
that type of heat. So I
Yeah.
love the like analogy of acclimation because I feel like it's something I haven't really acclimated myself to before. And until you said that, like a light bulb went off for me.
Yeah. And you raise a good point. So often, including us in Dallas, when we're in a hot climate, we often go from air conditioned house to air conditioned car to air conditioned office, and we're not exposed to that heat. And so you might say, "Oh, I'm in Dallas," or "You're in Florida, so you're acclimated to the heat." Well, you're really not, unless you actually are exposed to the heat. And so you'd want to make sure that you have that exposure.
Mhm. Yeah, and Amber kind of started bringing this up, but before we get into the heat risk calculator, can you talk about maybe some of like the signs or what survivors should be looking out for when they are maybe approaching being overheated or just an unsafe level, of heat stress?
Sure. Yeah. One of the questions that we were very interested in is whether burn survivors had an increased sensitivity, that is,
Mm.
perceptual sensitivity to the heat. Because as we started bringing more and more burn survivors into our lab, and we've got a chamber that we can dial in whatever temperature and humidity we like, often the burn survivors were saying that they were too hot. And in fact, they weren't really that hot. And it made us question whether a burn survivor's perception of how hot they are was reduced.
Mm.
And we collected the data and did not actually find that. What we found was that their perception of the heat was appropriate relative to how hot they actually were. And that as burn survivors would get hotter in the heat and they perceived that they were hotter. So that was appropriate. And to me, that's very reassuring. When I work with burn survivors, it tells me that you need to listen to your body because your body is telling you the correct information. If you as a burn survivor are feeling overheated, and some of the classic examples are the same thing for non-burn individuals. Do you feel overly fatigued? Are you getting a headache? Are you feeling lightheaded? Are you feeling confused, a little bit dizzy? Um, all of which, of course, associate with heat exposure. You need to pay attention to that and seek an air-conditioned space and make sure that you start to cool off. When you start to get cramps or you start to become mentally confused, now you're transitioning
Mm.
um, from a heat um, risk to a more serious heat condition, not quite heat stroke. A heat stroke is somebody who essentially is unconscious, and that's at the
Mm.
point you need somebody else to help you. But before that, when you're conscious but you're feeling a bit confused, you definitely need to reach out and not reach out, but get some help, but seek an air conditioned space. The key
Mhm.
point, though, is that burn survivors have the capability, as well as not to the same level as non-burn survivors, to perceive how hot they are. And therefore, if you're feeling too hot, you need to stop what you're doing and seek a cooler space.
Mhm.
I think it's
Yeah. No,
I
go
don't
ahead,
know if
Amber.
this is real either, and I know you mentioned some things, but this happens to me, and I find it fascinating, and it's happened since I've been injured. My right leg has a skin graft on it, and if I get too hot randomly, I can't control it. We've always called them pings. Like it almost feels
Mm.
like a brief, like I have pins and needles for 30 seconds in my right leg and then it goes
Mm.
away. And
Mhm.
so I don't know if anyone else gets that, but I get it all the time. If I get too hot, it's like my body telling me like that it's having trouble and it needs to cool down for a minute.
Which is
Mhm.
interesting because when we measure skin temperature of grafted skin, it's always a lot higher in the heat relative to non-grafted skin. And that's because that grafted skin's not sweating. So you're not getting the evaporative cooling. And I don't know if that's what's driving this pinging sensation. I've not heard that before. I've not.
Yeah, it's wild. And it doesn't happen all the time. It's like, I notice if I get too hot or I'm in a scenario that I'm like overly nervous about, I'll get it. I haven't had one in a while, but I also haven't been out on like extreme heat in a long time. But yeah, especially in the beginning. And I've heard a couple of survivors get it, like where it almost like sends a signal, and it like literally feels like someone's taking pins and needles and throwing them at me for a second and pulling them back. It's the weirdest thing.
It goes away.
Then. It goes away instantly. Like it will come over, and I've literally said before, okay, I have them. I got to go take a minute because it's hot. Like, and so it's the oddest thing. I don't know if it's like other people have it, but it has happened to me, and it's so bizarre.
Yeah, quite interesting.
Well, and I was going to say too, for me, what's interesting is when we think about the heat, we think about being outside, and like, at least for me, I think about like hot, sunny weather.
Sure.
But every time that I've overheated, for the most part, hasn't actually been, I mean, sometimes it's been outside in the sun, but it's more so to the point of like, it's hard for ourselves to like keep our body temperature regulated, because I've been inside where I'm just like the one time I was playing basketball and I passed out because I got overheated. And another time I was at a yard sale. One time I was getting my prom dress fitted inside in this like little room at like the seamstress house. And it was a big dress. It was really hot. There was no airflow. And I just got overheated and I was inside. So it can happen anywhere.
You raise a really good point. And the way that our body's temperature are regulated, there's two ways that we can get heat. And one is through exercise, and that would be your basketball. You know, if you play basketball, your muscles are producing a lot of heat, and that heat needs to go someplace. And if you have less skin available to dissipate that heat, that's obviously bad. Your skin you can also get heat from the environment. And we all know this. You stand in the sun, it feels hotter than when you're in the shade. You're accumulating heat. And as you need to recognize that you can still get heat stressed even though you're not being physically active. Particularly in a warm environment, whether it's in an enclosed space with no air conditioning and lots of insulation from this dress, or whether it's playing basketball, even in an air-conditioned area, which we'll get into this a little bit. It depends on how hard you're working, and that is how much heat your body's actually generating, which is the most difficult factor for us to predict a heat-related injury in a burn survivor, because we don't really know how hard they're truly exercising.
Well, I do want to make sure we talk about the heat risk calculator. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can walk through it. But Craig, why don't you just kind of start by telling us, like, how did the heat risk calculator come to be? What inspired you guys to create it? Just tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. You know, often burn survivors would ask us, how do I know it's safe for me to exercise? How do I know this particular environment is safe? And one of the concerns that we have, actually there's two concerns, and that developed this calculator. The first concern is obvious, and that is there an environment that, based upon an individual's unique physiological characteristics, including their burn, that they are unsafe for them to perform that physical activity? And the other side, though, as a burn survivor population, that is epidemiological data. That's when they take thousands of people and try to understand characteristics. Burn survivors have a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart failure, diabetes, and hypertension. And we believe one of the reasons why is because burn survivors as a population are less physically active. And we think thermal intolerance is one of the reasons that drives burn survivors to be less active, be less likely to go play basketball, less likely to go for a walk. They say, oh, I've got my burn injuries, I'm going to get too hot. And so we developed this burn calculator based upon all the data and 15, 20 years of research to help the burn survivor, one, know when it is safe for them to exercise, because it's that they could exercise just fine without a risk of a heat injury, as well as when it's not safe for them to exercise, because we feel that the exercise, that it's too hot based upon their unique characteristics. So we developed this calculator here that you can see. It's a burn risk calculator, and it's not perfect. We want to emphasize, first off, don't go by this calculator. Go by how you're feeling. If you're feeling too hot, regardless as to what the calculator is saying, stop the exercise. This is an estimation. It's not precise, and it's all based upon populations, and your unique physiology could be very different. But what we do we want to walk through it? We can just kind of toy around with it. Okay, so you first enter the city, and this is really cool. The calculator goes out and identifies. So type in a city, maybe.
We can do what I can walk through it for myself. Do Charleston, South Carolina.
I think this is amazing because obviously, like if you live in Florida like me or something, it's going to change drastically.
Yep. Okay, and then if you're doing Rachel, unfortunately, you have to include the height and weight. Let me tell you why, is because what it's calculating now is the body surface area. We can estimate somebody's body surface area based upon their height and weight. So if you get a real big person, a real small person, they've got different amounts of skin to get rid of the heat. And so that's why the calculator requires that we enter the height and weight. And then activity level. This is, like I mentioned, this is the most difficult thing. If you click on the little question mark, you'll get to see a graphic here of how we can estimate what your activity level is. We've categorized this. We spent hours, days, maybe even weeks trying to come up with this particular figure here. We separated it into 5 categories. If somebody's just sitting rest, like perhaps you're putting on the prom dress, or doing low intensity walking, or moderate or high intensity, or playing very high intensity basketball, the individual needs to choose here how strenuous the physical activity is. So for example, if they're going for a walk just around the neighborhood, you'd obviously put low. But if they're maybe mowing the lawn or doing something a little bit more physically demanding, you would select moderate. If they're exercising intentionally, that is, they're gonna ride the bike for 30 minutes, you put high. And maybe if they're competing in a race or something that's very physically demanding, you would put very high. So if you close that out, you then select an activity. So select an activity, Rachel, that go ahead and click on there.
Let's do moderate.
Okay. And then clothing. Because clothing has an insulating capacity, the same sort of thing. We divided this into 5 categories: very light, moderate, heavy, very heavy. I don't know why in the heat anyone would do anything other than light and very light, but we put this in just in case. And it actually adds a factor onto the heat risk calculator. Obviously, the more clothing you have, the less tolerant you would be to the heat. And then so you can select here some clothing coverage, light. And then here you put in your burn surface area. One of the things that we have found is that burn survivors typically overestimate or over-report their actual burn surface area. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if when they first had the injury, a physician said you had 30%, but then later on it was found to be 20%. And what's in their mind is 30%. So for all of our studies, we actually estimate their burn surface area, and typically it's not uncommon that's lower. Here you put 30%, which is great. And then how long will you plan this exercise bout to be?
Let's do 30 minutes today.
Okay. And then click on the the next thing. This is the environment. So you can choose, go to the right a little bit, click on that little arrow.
Yeah.
Let's do it outside in the sun.
Yeah.
Direct sunlight today.
So you click on the little arrow to the right, right there. Perfect. Right there.
There you go.
And is it not?
Oh, I can see it on my screen. Sorry, for some reason it's.
Yeah, maybe because it's down below. So those that are looking at this, what Rachel is seeing is a variety of different places.
Maybe that works. I thought I helped with taking that banner down.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why. But
I can see them though. I see the 5 options.
Go, Rachel, read off the options you've got.
We have outside and in the shade, outside and in direct sun, indoors and in an air-conditioned space, indoors and in a moderately warm space, or indoors in a hot space.
And that last one, indoors and hot space, was for one reason, and that's my daughter was doing that bokeh yoga, or is that what it's called? The heat yoga.
Like hot Pilates or
hot
things
yoga.
like that.
I used to do that all the time before my burn injury, and it's so funny. Talking about acclimation, in the very beginning, it was like unbearable, and over time, I was able to build my tolerance up back to it. But yes,
Yep.
It's hot. It's hot. It gets hot and humid in there.
Yeah, and that's why we selected. So go ahead and select calculate, and hopefully.
Okay, we'll do outside in the direct sun today.
Okay, perfect. And I'm hopeful that, perfect. Okay. So what it's doing here, and scroll down a little bit so that we can see the time scale on the, there we go, perfect. So what it's doing is it's saying at the time right now, it's categorizing your risk of a heat-related injury based upon the time, and then in the next 20 hours going forward. So it shows here at around noon in Charleston, South Carolina, that you would be on the border between I guess it would be in the high, I guess, right smack pretty much in the middle, maybe between moderate and high. So you could perform the exercise, but you've got to be careful that you're at risk. If you wait till, by the way, 3 a.m., then you're in a low risk if you choose to exercise. But what this tells you, that if you decide to go out at 7 a.m., that you're in a fairly a safe zone. There are some key recommendations. If you click on that key recommendations, it will indicate consider suspending the activity until it's cooler. We are very conservative with these. We want to err on the side of being conservative, and that is keeping individuals safe. And so these recommendations are always focused on conservative recommendations. So if you want to, you can scroll up and change to where Amber is living, and we can just change the location and keep everything else the same just for fun.
I have a question. Does it adapt to the seasonality too? So like if is this all year, or is this like because it's the time of year it is? Like Craig, depending on the day that I do this, right? So it's currently June, but if I were to do this in January, does it show differently?
Yes, because what it's doing when you type in that city, it finds out what the weather is today at that hour. So when we type in Orlando, it's finding out what the weather is right now in Orlando, and then what it's going to be for the next 20 hours. And so if you do this in the winter and in Orlando and it's 65 degrees, you're going to see in a completely different scale than when you do it in Orlando and it is 85 degrees.
Right. Okay, cool. That's what my question was.
And then if we go up, let's just for fun, let's go up and change the burn surface area to I don't know, 60%. And you can see it changed the profile. But one of the reasons why we're not in a real high category here is much of our data says that if somebody's exercising for 30 minutes, they really don't get hot enough in 30 minutes to make much of a risk. So if we change the duration to, for example, 45 minutes, you'll see things will change.
Oh, wow. That really changed it.
Yeah, it really does. And so one of the things we found is that if somebody's exercising for just 30 minutes, even in the heat, it's really not long enough for their core temperature to get to a point of concern. But after that, regardless of the burn size, but after that, then you go up to 45 to 60 minutes, then there gets to be more of a problem. But what's really what we love about this calculator, we are really striving to get this out, and thank you to the Phoenix Society for being integral in helping get this out to the burn survivors, is that it provides them, again, those two things. One, where it's unsafe for them to exercise or perform physical activity. It doesn't have to be exercise. It could just be out walking. And two, when they can do so safely, like you said, for that 30-minute period, you'd be just fine in Orlando or in Charleston to go out and do a moderate level of physical activity with your burns.
Well, this is good news for me, though, at least, because I'm a morning workout girly. So I will be sticking to those 7 a.m. runs if I'm going outside.
Yep. And I was there this morning. I'm being in Dallas. I do the same thing. I much prefer the morning, although you get the humidity a little bit higher in the morning.
For sure.
Well, it also looks like we've got some questions coming in, Craig, too, for you. So I can throw those up on the screen, Rachel, if we have some time here.
Yeah. Stop sharing for now.
This one's from Lynn. She says, can heart rate have a sudden increase when overheated? I had a situation where it was very hot. I live in Florida. Welcome, Lynn. Me too. I was walking to a party and got very hot very quickly, and my heart rate suddenly increased to 145, and I needed to sit down in the shade for over an hour and remained rather sick for the rest of the day.
Yeah. Lynn, absolutely. Heart rate is a very good indicator of how hot you are and how much of a stress your body's undergoing. When you're heated, heart rate always goes up. We see that consistently. And so if you see a scenario such as this, that you are overheated, definitely pay attention. I'm sorry, and your heart rate's elevated, definitely pay attention to that as a potential sign that you are overheated. Heart rates are, so, it's wonderful now with all these gadgets, wearables. That was the term I'm thinking, all these wearables. So you can find out what your heart rate is. And if your heart rate normally is around, if you're out for a light walk, 90 beats per minute, and then you're starting to feel fatigued and it's around 140, that's definitely a sign that you need to do something else. One of the things you could have done is sit down in the shade, but you could also use water to your benefit. We've been looking at water spraying and helping evaporative cooling, particularly with cooler water spraying over you. So if you'd sit down in the shade and then had some water and poured some water over you, that would have been even more effective than just resting in the shade to help you feel better. But absolutely, yes to your question. Heart rate is a good indicator of how hot you are.
We got one more for you. I struggle with thermoregulation, and when I get too hot, my stress level ratchets up too. I really feel like they feed on each other, but I don't know that that's supported by science. From Christy Puckett.
Yeah. Depends how you define stress. There's no question that anxiety and discomfort, agitation, I guess that's probably a really good term. The hotter we get, all of those are flared up. We have various scales in our lab that we have people rate their thermal comfort and their rating of perceived exertion, as well as one I'm drawing a blank on, all try to capture these subjective feelings that accompany heat. They don't. I wouldn't say they feed on each other, and that is the more anxious you are or the more stressed you are, you're not going to necessarily get hotter. But there's no question that the more hot you are, the more stressed you are, and the more anxious you are. And in fact, it even goes beyond that when we look at variations in seasonal variations, and we look at things like murder, assaults. They're always higher in the summer, and I think it's related to this. As people are heated, they've got a shorter fuse, so to speak.
Quite literally heated.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and it's interesting to put those two together.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point too, of like when I'm feeling overheated and I'm trying to cool myself down, or I always say, like, I'm not trying to cause a scene. I'm just trying to, I tell like my husband or a friend, like, hey, I'm feeling hot. Like I need to like step out or whatnot. But then you do get more anxious because I'm like, oh no, what happens if I pass out? Like I'm like out at a friend's house or something, like whatever it may be. So it's funny. That doesn't help the situation then when you start getting anxious and feeling stressed about being overheated.
Yeah. And again, with your friends that you would just explain that, that you are a burn survivor and you're more susceptible to heat injuries and you really need to go inside and can I go inside or go inside your car and make sure for the air conditioner, to use your air conditioning if you need a personal air conditioned space. Yeah, that's all very important.
Well, and I know you talked too about, the spray bottles. I know, those like mobile fans that even like go in at the bottom of your phone, or the hats with the fans are really popular now. But what are some other ways or cooling mechanisms would you recommend to survivors to try out?
Yeah, let's first talk about the fan. So the water. We find that water is effective, and that is if you're out, let's say, in the heat, recognize that, again, your grafted area doesn't sweat. So if we spray some water on it, it does improve things. The skin temperature is lower. It's not as impactful as we had hoped. We thought it would be much more impactful. The core temperature is not as high, particularly in big burns when you use the water spray, but we thought that it would completely normalize the responses similar to a non-burned individual, and we didn't see that. and we're exploring why that is. So water spray is effective, but not as effective as I'd like it to be. The fans are effective as long as the air isn't too hot. And the best way to describe this is there's something called a convection oven, and that's an oven that has heat and a fan, and that's going to cook a turkey a lot faster when you're blowing that hot air around. So if the air is above 37 degrees, I'm thinking of 37 degrees centigrade. If it's above like 95 degrees, the fans may not work and they may actually be detrimental because you're blowing hot air. If you add water spray and the fan, that seems to temper it somewhat. So so the first one, water spray, works. One of the things we're very interested in, and we don't have any data, is ingesting cold fluid. Slurpees, So I'm overheated, should I take a Slurpee? The data suggests that it should work. We've not evaluated that experimentally. We really want to, particularly now that you can get a home Slurpee. I guess Ninja or other companies are making these home Slurpee or home slushy machines to see to what extent that could be beneficial for burn survivors. You could get yourself out of another way is using a bathtub, putting cold water or cooler water in a bathtub and immersing yourself. That's very effective at cooling you down very rapidly. So I think that would be, but really those are the avenues that you have. And then air conditioned space obviously is huge.
Definitely.
Is this is this for me? I'm not sure. Is this,
I was able to put a poll up for our folks that are listening in. So the QR code to the heat calculator is right above my head here. But how does hot weather affect you as a burn survivor? And there's 4 questions there for folks that want to participate. And it looks like we did just get another question too. I live in a humid environment near sea and want to know how to deal with itching and rashes when it comes to heat.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not an area, and I'm not a physician, so I've tried to avoid going into that space. And I've not explored that question, so I really don't have any insight on how to address the itchiness that it's very common in burn survivors and grafted skin. And I think was it redness? Was it redness and itchiness?
It looks like itching and rashes.
Oh,
yeah,
rashes.
I do also get itchy sometimes if you're overheating. I feel like I get that, Rachel. I don't know about you, but I've heard of that before.
Yeah, and I think, for me, what I've done in the past is aloe works really well, especially if it's cool. Pro tip, put it in the fridge. That really helps. And also sometimes I use a little cortisone cream if I'm going to bed and don't want to be scratching all night.
Sure.
And yes, to submit to the poll, you just put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat, as Rachel just did there, and that'll help with learning what the how hot weather affects you as a burn survivor.
Yeah.
I really liked. I really liked how you used the turkey analogy, because it is true, especially here in Florida. Like, we have fans that we use. But I'm going to use Disney as an example, because when I think about being like oppressively hot, it's like standing in the middle of the park on a hot day, right? And sometimes the fans just don't do it for me, right? Especially when it's really, really warm out. But I also feel like we recently, my son loves those like spray bottles that you see at Disney that have the little fans associated.
Sure.
And it is true. Like, when you have the water with the spraying involved, or like I see my husband's big into those like Ryobi mister fans that you can get, the fans with the cool mist. I do feel like those significantly make a difference comparatively to just like when it's 90 degrees and hot and you just have this warm air blowing around you.
Yeah. And going back to the turkey analogy, if turkeys sweat, a convection oven would be less effective. But turkeys don't sweat, and that's why they cook faster.
But that's why we're all just a bunch of sitting turkeys outside, right?
but you're right. And one of the reasons why we're more concerned about the fans with burn survivors is because that grafted area doesn't sweat. And so if you have moisture on your skin and then apply the fan, that hot air is less detrimental because of the evaporative cooling that occurs. But if somebody has significant grafts and doesn't have the moisture because they're not sweating, then the fans would actually be more detrimental to somebody with a larger burn than somebody with a small burn or no burn. So there's no question that the water spray with the fan, when you add the water spray, it actually allows for a higher temperature that you can still, higher temperature air that you can still have a cooling benefit relative to if you didn't have that water spray.
Interesting. I'd like to talk for a minute. I know we talked about like cooling modalities. I want to talk about water. I know like for me, sometimes just drinking water isn't enough. Like I know we talk about like liquid IV and like Powerades and stuff. Do you feel like those are effective also, especially when it comes to outdoor activities and whatnot?
Yeah. And this goes beyond just burn survivors. So this is now, there's really no unique observation for burn survivors with respect to some of these products. It's really for everybody, with one caveat that we'll come back to. Water is typically fine if your activity is going to be less than an hour or so. Water is just fine. You're not losing enough fluid that you need to have. Really, what we're talking about is an electrolyte-based beverage or mixture. The liquid IV, it's essentially very expensive salt water with a little bit of flavoring, as well as all these products are. And most of the time we get enough salt in our diet that for 1 hour exercise is you're good with water alone. As you get beyond that and you got continuous exposure, then you need to start thinking about some of these electrolytes, because you're sweating so much and you sweat for so long that you're starting to deplete some of those electrolytes, and you need to put some electrolytes back in. So I use, just as what the term is, standard, that when you're about an hour or more, start thinking about some sort of an electrolyte solution. One of the unique aspects, though, of somebody with a large burn injury is, remember, that burned area doesn't sweat, so you're not losing as much fluid from that burned area. However, your non-burned area may sweat a lot more. And so don't think that because your burned area is not sweating that you don't need to be as hydrated, or you don't need to focus on hydration as much. You still need to focus on hydration because you're losing more fluid from your non-burned area. And so you still could be losing the same amount of fluid. So again, I want to make sure people understand that. Somebody might say, well, I've got half my body doesn't sweat, so therefore I can just drink half as much water. That's not true. You still need to adequately hydrate yourself, just like a non-burned individual.
Well, and I, growing up was always in sports, and my parents always, yes, wanted me to stay hydrated regardless. But I almost think it's more important to make sure we are, as burn survivors, staying hydrated, because if we're already struggling to regulate our temperature, let alone when you add dehydration on top of it, it's not going to make exercise or any outdoor activity any easier if you're also not hydrated. And that's one thing we can be, we can actually do ourselves and make sure that we're taking accountability for.
Rachel, you're absolutely right. And just for 30 seconds, I explain why. When we are dehydrated, our body sends a signal to try to preserve our water. It's saying, don't lose so much water. And so we pee less and we sweat less. So therefore, the skin that you have the capability of sweating from, if you're dehydrated, will sweat less. So now you're right, it would be a double whammy, because half of your body, for example, if you've got a 50% burn, is not sweating. And now because you're dehydrated, the half that can sweat is not sweating appropriately because you're dehydrated. It really is a significant risk. Another question here.
One more question here. Sometimes the tachycardia gets in as if burn scars are more than sweating is a problem. So how do I deal with that?
So when tachycardia is a fancy term meaning high heart rate. And so sometimes the high heart rate gets in as if burn scars are more, then sweating has a problem. So how do I deal with that? I'm struggling a little bit to understand the question.
Yeah, I think what he's trying to say is he has a high heart rate, and the burn scars make it like more difficult for him to deal with.
Yeah,
the sweating.
So I'm thinking, as far as the high heart rate is, what we mentioned before, is it's very normal, because the heart rate is relative to how hot you are, and burn survivors will get hotter, so their heart rates will be higher. And your non-burn skin will sweat more. So it's not surprising to me that you have a high heart rate and you see more sweating from the non-burned area. Now, as your body stops sweating, let's say you're dehydrated, that's going to cause your core temperature to be even higher, and then you're going to result in a even higher heart rate or greater tachycardia. So there's definitely a relation, as we mentioned, between your core temperature and how high your heart rate is.
Mm-hmm.
I thank you, Craig. I know we're coming up on time here, but I want to hear a little bit about like what's next for your research. And for those that are listening today, is there a way that they can get involved or contact you for any other future opportunities?
Yeah, let's do the second one first. We are a very active NIH-funded research laboratory. And we have funding from the NIH, from our tax dollars, to better understand some of the risks associated with burn injuries and bring people in throughout all of North America, or actually primarily United States and Canada. So we recruit burn survivors, and they come in and they spend a couple of days with us here in Dallas, and we do various tests to try to better understand and come up with modalities to reduce the risk. And I don't know the best way. I'm happy to provide contact information for people can reach out to us to
Is there a
acquire.
website that they can go to, Craig?
There is, yes. I can put it, give me just a second here and I will pull it up.
And while you're pulling that up too, we'll make sure we have that in the comments and the show notes. But if anyone has any questions or wants to get connected with Craig, you can always send an email or reach out to Phoenix Society, and we're happy to get you guys connected.
I'll definitely put it on the banner too, Craig, once you send it over.
Yeah. I just put our website. Now we are an active website. We don't look just at burn survivors. We're also looking at very similar questions in older individuals who are taking medications that might be detrimental. And heart failure, looking at heart failure, people with heart failure. Let me also, hold on a second, I'm going to give an email address here. Just give me a moment. And I still know there's a second question that I need to answer that I'm happy to answer. Okay, this is the longest email address available, and I don't really know how it evolved to that, but this is the email address. This would be the best way for somebody to reach out to us.
Okay.
I don't know if the individuals out there can see that, or if you want to post it.
I'm going to put it on a banner for them right now.
Perfect. Yeah. And this is the best way to post that, or to reach out to us to find out more about the studies. So where are we going with this? We recently received 5 years of additional funding to focus on questions of interest with respect to burn survivors. And we've kind of migrated a little bit to the occupational space. And how does a burn injury affect one's ability to perform in an occupational setting that is accompanied with heat? Classic example would be a construction worker. So if somebody has a burn injury, does that preclude them from being a construction worker? And we're exploring those questions now. Just yesterday, I got an email from a physician who's working with a burn survivor that's got a 65% burn and wants to go back into his career as a wildland firefighter. Can this individual do so safely? So we're trying to explore different, like, work rest cycles. For example, if somebody's got a significant burn and they, in a particular environment, if they perform that work, let's say construction on a road crew, for 45 minutes, how long of a break do they need to have to stay safe before they get back on the work crew? It's called a work rest cycle. And OSHA, our government regulations that manages employment-related issues, has very strict work rest cycles based upon the environment. And all those studies, none of those studies have been done in burn survivors. So we're starting to explore those questions as to what we know works for non-burned individuals. How does that work, or how does it need to be modified for burn survivors? And what can they do in an employment environment? Would water spray work? Would ingesting cold water work when they have to do some sort of a job in the heat, whether that's in a factory that next to a furnace, or whether it's on a construction site? or other areas. So we've migrated a little bit. We're still looking at some of our basic questions as to how we reduce the risk of burn survivors. But again, we're kind of toying more with this employment-related avenues.
Awesome. Well, we always ask our guests 2 final questions before we let them go. And this season, my question will be, if this season of your life had a soundtrack or a song, what would it sound like? So is there a song or particular, like this time of your life, what is your song you're listening to?
You're asking me this question?
I'm asking you, Craig.
Oh, wow. I love playing the guitar, and I love playing classic rock. And so, but part of the problem is I've got all these different things going through my mind right now as far as songs. And for some reason, Hotel California comes up, just because everyone who plays classic rock has to learn how to play Hotel California.
Right.
But then I'm thinking about the phrases of Hotel California. And I'm not very clever, so I'm struggling.
Okay, I think that's a great.
I would say Hotel California, maybe because I've got a beautiful sunset in my mind, and
there you go.
A direction to where we're going, and I'm just making it up.
I love it. Well, we've had all kinds of answers this season so far, so exciting. But I'll let Rachel ask her final question before we close out today.
Yeah, our final question is our Phoenix partner question today, sponsored by BC. And so their question is, what is one message that you hope sticks with our listeners after today?
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. I think that the most important thing that we want to do is to keep burn survivors safe. And I want burn survivors to know that they can be safe and they can be physically active. And you can stave off some of the diseases associated with the sedentary lifestyle. That by being smart, listening to your body, being physically active, that you can be physically active and you can enjoy all the benefits, whether it's just, I don't know, jumping on a trampoline with a grandson or whatever. You can do that as long as you recognize that you have a higher risk and you modulate that based upon how long you're participating in the activity, and recognize how hot you're feeling and stop the activity when you're too hot. So that's the key message I want people to know, that burn survivors have a greater risk of a heat-related illness or injury, but that doesn't mean you can't and you shouldn't be physically active, but rather you should be physically active so you don't pick up some of the other consequences that are so common in the burn survivor community, and that is diseases of what we call a sedentary lifestyle. So be active.
Mm-hmm.
I love that message. Well, we want to thank you for your time today. This was an awesome podcast. You brought us so much information that I, myself, have not even known. So it was really a pleasure to have you, Craig, today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
We'll talk.
Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you, Craig. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.